thank you, Nancy, and by now I'm smart enough to figure out it's going to take them a minute to change over for Ken Westlake, and so while they're doing that, I'm just going to let everybody here know we do want you to encourage you when you leave here tonight to take part in the public process for this initial proposal. The public comment period is open through February 3rd. There will be 2 public meetings next week. One Wednesday night in Aurora, one Thursday night in Blaine, and there is a handout outside on the League of Women Voters table with times and locations for those meetings, the addresses to which you can send public comments, and also the locations of that big 3-volume draft environmental impact statement if that's something that you want to look at. There is a copy on the table out there tonight for a demonstration, but we hope that when you leave here tonight you'll take the information you have and get involved. And with that, I'll introduce our last speaker, who's Ken Westlake from EPA Region 5.
Thanks, Julie. Since I knew that my colleagues from the other agencies would not be here tonight, Kristen labored to get their participation and let me know that they wouldn't be here. So I thought one of the things that I could do to add some value to tonight's discussion would be to walk you through what U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's role is in this issue. And I'll touch on 3 aspects: regulatory programs, the environmental review process that I'm a manager for at the Chicago office, and then some rulemakings affecting this industrial sector that are of interest to the projects pending here in Minnesota. Okay, first of all, it's important to understand that while there are numerous federal environmental laws that set a baseline across the country, that most of those provisions have been delegated to the states. And EPA sets standards. We establish a regulatory framework, and states that want to operate those programs on our behalf have to demonstrate that they have comparable laws, regulations, capabilities, and standards. And in the case of Minnesota, our principal partner is the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and they have delegated programs operated for the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, the Federal Hazardous Waste Law, so the Safe Drinking Water Acts managed by the State Department of Public Health. But we do have a strong partnership with the state of Minnesota on implementation of federal environmental programs. And therefore, MPCA will be the lead agency for permitting any issues related to air emissions, water effluent emissions, and hazardous waste management, subject to EPA's oversight. That oversight takes many forms. We do provide some funding to the state agencies to help them with implementing these federal programs. We talk with them regularly about their key permits that they have under development or under review, and we weigh in there. And in the process, we try to ensure that there's a national program worthy of the delegations that we've provided using the authorities that Congress gave us. We also have a compliance role. Here again, for the main environmental laws in Minnesota, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency is in the lead, but we develop a work plan with them annually associated with our grant activities, and we retain all of the enforcement activities and authorities that the state has. So when we develop our annual work plan, we divvy up the pie as to who's going to take what sources or what topics. We do cooperate with them. We do some joint inspections. Sometimes we do inspections that they can't cover and vice versa. But the point is, we have a major enforcement and compliance and inspection role here in the state of Minnesota for the federal laws that we've delegated to the state. And I should highlight to you in my conversations with our national mining people in Washington that hard rock mining as an industrial sector is a very high priority national inspection and enforcement industrial sector for EPA. Now, the principal authorities for permitting these particular projects as they're proposed rest with other agencies as well. You've heard already tonight that the Corps of Engineers has responsibility under the Clean Water Act for evaluating and making decisions on wetland permitting. And there again, EPA shares some authorities. The actual permitting is done by the Corps of Engineers. We have joint enforcement authorities, and we routinely review major proposed permit actions by the Corps, and we have codified in our relationship with them and in the Clean Water Act itself an ability to escalate disputes that we might have with the Corps of Engineers on wetland permitting issues, including a rarely used but important veto tool that we have invoked on some major projects over time. On the state level, the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources implements state mining law, and they have permitting responsibilities there. You've already heard a little bit about the Forest Service as another federal agency that has a key stake in this part of the state, with the Superior National Forest being either part of the footprint of some of these mining proposals or immediately adjacent to. And of course, the Fish and Wildlife Service is the lead agency responsible for seeing that the Endangered Species Act is complied with. And Nancy's already explained to you some of the unique roles that tribes in northeastern Minnesota have under the 1854 treaty, and the role that her reservation has implementing the Clean Water Act, because they've got EPA-approved water quality standards. The environmental review process is the aspect of this enterprise that my shop in Chicago is responsible for. It is the National Environmental Policy Act, and for the sake of keeping things on schedule, I will use the acronym NEPA. It's pretty common, and when you hear it, that's what it stands for. It is a process that is triggered by federal action. And it's important to know that not all of the mining proposals that are currently in play in this part of Minnesota involve federal actions. The federal actions are typically triggered if there's a federal permit involved, if there is federal funding, such as the Mesaba Energy power plant proposal up on the Iron Range. That's a Department of Energy project that involves federal funding, so there's an environmental impact statement under NEPA involved with that project. And then also, if a project is proposed for federal lands, that's a federal action that triggers NEPA. The purpose of NEPA is to ensure that environmental issues are fully considered in federal decision making. Those are not the only issues that federal decision makers have to wrestle with. And therefore, it's important to understand that NEPA by itself does not dictate the outcome of any federal decision-making deliberation. But it does establish a process that is intended to be analytical, comprehensive, and looking at direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts to all different kinds of environmental media, as well as social factors and environmental justice. And it's intended to be a very open, transparent, and public process, most particularly the public comment period that we're now in the midst of for the PolyMet proposal. Corps of Engineers has a wetland permitting decision to make on a number of these projects, including PolyMet, and that triggers their need to comply with NEPA. And similarly, there's a state law that's an analog to NEPA that the Department of Natural Resources must consider in its process of evaluating mining permits. So the result for a number of these projects has been a joint environmental impact statement developed by the DNR and the Corps of Engineers. And those are some of the projects that have relied on a joint process. Not all of them are copper mining. In fact, MSI, Keetac, and Natal are primarily taconite iron projects, but they've all relied on that joint partnership between DNR and the Corps of Engineers. Now, EPA as an agency is unique in that we are required by law to review and comment on all environmental impact statements. We also have the ability to, on a discretionary basis, to comment on other NEPA documents. But for EISs, we have to review and comment, and we have to make our comments part of the public record. And the goal in our involvement there is to do what we can through our analysis, our independent analysis, and our persuasiveness to improve the environmental outcomes of federal decision making. Again, remembering that NEPA does not dictate the outcome. And our comments are advisory. That sometimes surprises people because they think, well, EPA must have the ability to say yay or nay on projects. Our comments are advisory in this case. But they are very influential, and because they are influential, we choose our words carefully, and we try to do our homework thoroughly, and we will certainly attempt to do so in the cases involving Minnesota mines. And we engage in the project, particularly for major projects, from the very start, scoping where the environmental impact process is being planned, through the actual review of the documents, and finally through any mitigation that's necessary. We do have a rating system that we make part of the public process, particularly at the draft EIS stage. Our ratings go in ascending order of severity from lack of objections to environmental concerns to environmental objections, and environmentally unsatisfactory is our nuclear deterrent. It's rarely used, but in cases where we find the impacts to be unacceptable to public health or the natural environment, we can put that issue on the table and make it the basis for referring to the White House Council on Environmental Quality, a small and little-known agency who oversees the NEPA process nationally and also referees disputes between federal agencies on environmental issues. We also evaluate the adequacy of the EIS document itself as adequate, insufficient, or inadequate, depending on how informative it is of the key topics that we think need to be analyzed for a thorough consideration of the issues. And again, an inadequate rating is rare, but that also can result in a referral to the Council on Environmental Quality. Just to wrap up here, there are some pending rulemakings going on that are underway nationally that have particular bearing on the hard rock mining sector. The first of which is financial assurance. We find as an agency that the hard rock mining industry historically has been a major source of toxic effluent to the environment, and therefore we made a finding in July in the Federal Register that we were going to develop national standards for financial assurance for this industry. And that was based on the high risk of environmental injury that we thought that industry as a whole presented, both historically and in terms of many of its current operations. That isn't to say that any given project presents those issues, but as a whole, this is an industry that we've got some serious issues with. We're also in the process of revising the surface water discharge standards, the effluent guidelines, for the mining and metals processing industries. And we've also engaged in some efforts to clarify just what the hard rock mining industry is required to report under the toxic release inventory, which is a public process for disclosing emissions of a variety of chemicals to land, water, and air. Should be highlighted that rulemaking is a multi-year process. In the case of the financial assurance regulation development, we don't think there will be something on the street as a draft probably for about a year, and if all goes well, probably not until 2011 will those standards be in place. And of course, no sooner do we issue them than they are usually litigated by one party or another. So the current mining proposals will be subject to what's currently on the books. But these regulations that are under development certainly have the potential for affecting current mines as they are implemented. So at that point, I will conclude my overview of EPA's role in this process. And I think the next portion of the program is your questions. So thank you.